Every time you leave home, another road takes you into a world you were never in before. When you travel, a new silence goes with you, and if you listen, you will hear what your heart would love to say. A journey can become a sacred thing. Have you ever traveled somewhere and the place changed you? Visited a different place that changed you forever? Well, let me tell you what happened to me. A simple trip to Grand Canyon opened my mind to better understand the commonality of humanity across cultures. As I and all the other mothers from many different countries were simultaneously, frantically yelling at their children in all different languages to stay away from the canyon's edge. And that is a true story. And went, oh my gosh, we're all the same. Travel changes your perspective of the world in the most incredible ways imaginable. You become open to different ways of life. Our guest speaker today, a traveler in her own right, is Dr. Kendra Weddle. Her remarkable background includes a PhD in religious studies and a professor of religion for over 20 years. She recently decided to shift her focus from university contexts to faith communities. As such, she currently serves as a scholar in residence at North Haven Church in Dallas and has discovered that she enjoys preaching. She has become a frequent guest preacher at All People's Church UU in Fort Worth, in addition to preaching and writing liturgy at North Haven Church. Kendra loves the outdoors, except for the very hot weather, and her hobbies include reading memoirs and fiction and baking. She lives in Irving with her husband, Brian, and their adored Labrador, Rue. We welcome Dr. Weddle and look forward to hearing her words of wisdom.
Good morning. I want to thank you for inviting me into your space and into your pulpit this morning. I know that involves a lot of trust to open up your space to someone who hopefully says something that's of some help in some way. And so I appreciate the warm invitation this morning. So thank you. It was resplendent. The colors were vibrant, moving up and down and all around, head spinning in its splendor. And the size and scope of it, it was majestic, it was magnificent. It was such a display of glory that even now I struggle to describe it. So let's just say this was the most memorable evening I can remember. We, my husband and I, had traveled to France, and having walked a number of labyrinths, I wanted to see the cathedral in Chartres, known for its labyrinth. It's a design that enables pilgrimages for people to travel when traveling far and wide wasn't possible. And so there in the Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth appears in the tiles arranged on the floor, and it has become a pattern for labyrinths worldwide. And I imagine that many of you have walked a labyrinth. All right, so some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So after dinner, we decided to walk through the historic center of town. And soon we realized that we had unwittingly stumbled into a huge mass of people that were mingling in the city center. All the shops were closed and everyone was literally shoulder to shoulder. There wasn't room to pass without bumping up against 3 or 4 people at the same time. And I hate crowds like that. So I was quickly trying to find my way out of the chaos. And so we walked. And finally, as we were walking and the crowd started to thin and the sun began to set just ahead we could see some lights. Not regular street lights, but lights on a building. Something different. We couldn't quite make it out just yet. So we kept walking. And suddenly we began to see these brilliant reds and greens, blues and yellows, all were dancing on the facade of a building. Well, we were mesmerized. We marveled at all the colors and designs. They were laser light projections that were sophisticated but also whimsical. Turning the corner, we realized there was another lighting design ahead, and then there was another, and another after that. It was as if we were being beckoned, kind of called by all of these dazzling displays, calling us to imagine something more magical with every turn. Our walking tour of lights ended when we found ourselves back at the beginning, standing in front of the famous Chartres Cathedral. And this is magnificent, but doesn't even begin to give you some sense. The colors were moving. And it went on for 15 or 20 minutes, and it told the story of the making of the cathedral. Stunning. And even now, I completely fail to be able to convey to you the sheer joy and enchantment that we experienced that evening in Chartres. The medieval period, when scores of people undertook pilgrimages to visit what they believed to be holy sites, it is in this context that I offer our word of the day, peregrinate. I hope I piqued some interest with using a word that we hardly ever, if ever, have heard, right? But to peregrinate means to travel or to journey, and often to travel abroad and on foot, as in a pilgrim making their way, for example, on the Camino, on their way to Santiago de Compostela. This whole idea of going on a pilgrimage, is to peregrinate. And when I think about this idea, I'm struck by ideas of being in a new and different place, outside of our normal experience, kind of with a sense of feeling a little unmoored, right? Everything is new and different. And to think of it as being on foot means that there's a different timing. It's a slower pace. A pace that enables us to take it all in. Lingering, even. So today, as we ruminate together about peregrinating, I'm going back to this labyrinth in Chartres, thinking of imagining how we don't actually need to leave our ordinary lives in order to go deeper and to strengthen our spiritual muscles. We can do it right where we are. Popular writer and speaker Barbara Brown Taylor, she writes about this kind of spiritual work, and she talks about a traveler and the kind of pack that we need to take. And she suggests, let's take a really light pack. Because if we're taking a heavy pack, it means that we're relying on the certainty that we have everything we need. Might even mean that we're closed a little. We've got it all figured out. But I think this is a spirituality, peregrinating is a spirituality that's nimble. We take with us a little water, maybe a morsel of bread, piece of cheese, just enough to sustain us for the journey, but with lots of room to see what we encounter. And this is where I think that you, as a you community, are especially situated well, where you can experience the sacred, the mystery, the wonder that is beyond ourselves. You have carved out a seat on what many might see as the margins of organized religion. And you've said, here, come join us. We seek to know more. We desire to go where we haven't been before. We seek to create communities of light. And we travel lightly. I appreciate that. I think this is a really good place to be. You're able to draw on multiple ways and practices, and you experience wisdom wherever it can be found. But I don't think of this openness as primarily an internal, navel-gazing kind of thing. I think rather it's a deep calling that has its roots in living connected. We're connecting not only with the mystery, but we're connecting with each other. And this journey always takes us back to our neighbor. You might be familiar with the name Bryan Stevenson. Okay, great. You got some. All right. He's the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. It's a human rights organization in Montgomery, Alabama. You might also know him from the book he wrote, Just Mercy, and that became a film. Maybe you saw the movie. In a recent podcast called On Being with Krista Tippett, he shared a powerful story, and I want to share that with you now, because I think you will hear in it an invitation to peregrinate, to take up your journey to new places and corners of our world where we desperately need people on such meaningful journeys. It was a courtroom, packed full. It was packed full of people, of black people, white people, poor people, who had come because the black defendant was someone they had worked with, and they were seeking justice. The prosecutors, who of course were white, were angry that the courtroom had been filled with so many people of color and supporters of Mr. McMillan, the defendant. So the next day, they didn't let everyone come in, and they changed the courtroom. They put a metal detector just inside the courtroom door that everyone had to walk through. But more than that, they put a large German Shepherd at the other side. And it sent a very clear message to the black community. You can't come here. When Bryan Stevenson, the attorney for Mr. McMillan, got there and saw what was done, he complained to the judge to try to get it changed, but to no effect. So Mr. Stevenson then went outside and explained to the black community gathered there, explained what had been done and that it was unfair, and that he would try to get it rectified by the following day. So the black community that was gathered there identified a few people to go and sit in the remaining seats that were left in the courtroom that day. And there was this woman, Mrs. Williams, and she volunteered to go. And she was honored to be identified as a representative of her community. And so she walked through the doors of that courtroom with dignity and grace, holding her head high as she walked through the metal detector. But when she got in front of the dog, her fear paralyzed her. And as she stood there, her body started to shake. Tears began running down her face. And suddenly she let out a loud moan and turned around and fled the courtroom. By the end of the day, as he was walking out to his car, Mr. Stevenson, who had largely forgotten about Mrs. Williams and her darting away in fear, saw that she was sitting there waiting for him. So she approached him and said, "Mr. Stevenson, I feel so bad." "Oh, Mrs. Williams," he said, "no, don't feel bad about what they did." No, she answered. "I was supposed to be in that courtroom. I was meant to be there. I should have been there, and I failed." "Mrs. Williams," he replied, "please don't feel bad. They shouldn't have done that." But she continued, No, I let everybody down, and I feel it. But when I saw that dog, all I could think about were those protests where they put those dogs on us. I thought about Selma in 1965. And with that, she turned and walked away, tears still streaming down her face. The following morning, her sister informed Mr. Stevenson that when she got home the previous day, she didn't talk to anybody. She went straight to her room and spent the entire night there, praying all night long. The next morning, she let her community know that she wanted another opportunity, another chance to be the representative. And when they opened that courtroom door, there was Mrs. Williams. And Mr. Stevenson says you could hear her audibly saying, "I ain't scared of no dog." And as she walked through the door and walked through the metal detector, she walked right up to that dog and she said, "I ain't scared of no dog." And she walked past the dog and sat down on the front row of the courtroom and looked at Mr. Stevenson. "I'm here," she said. Mr. Stevenson replied, "Mrs. Williams, it's so good to see you." And then Mr. Stevenson turned around and began working on his papers, preparing for the next moment when the judge would come in. A few minutes later, she said, "No, Mr. Stevenson, you didn't hear me. I'm here," she said. Mr. Stevenson turned around and looked and said, "No, I do see you. I'm glad to see you here." Then the judge walked in and everybody stood up. And then, of course, once the judge was in, they sat back down. But slowly, Mr. Stevenson realized that people were staring. So he turned around. Mrs. Stevenson was still standing, and the courtroom got really quiet, and they were looking at her. And that's when she said one last time, "I am here." Mrs. Williams modeled faith in action. She wasn't just saying, "I'm physically present." She was saying, "I've got this vision of justice that compels me to stand up to injustice." "I'm here," Mrs. Williams said. She understood what she was called to do in that moment, and this calling wasn't easy. She had to get in touch with her deepest self, realizing that fear and finding a way to release it. And she had to trust that if she followed what she knew she needed to do, that all would be well. And she gave public witness to that oppression and stood it down. Now, one of our challenges, I think, is that we want to see immediate evidence of our work, right? Whether it's advocacy for our immigrant neighbor, whether it's helping secure cleaner air and water, befriending the stranger, feeling comfortable in our skin. We want to know where the final destination of the journey is, don't we? We want to see that our soul adventures change the structures that divide us, that they change the myriad ways we are working for justice, that they change the system. But I think another one of our challenges, and maybe one of more importance, or at least first order importance, is that we have to be willing to peregrinate. We have to get out of our comfort zones, of our boxes, of the places where we think we know and where we oftentimes no longer have a sense of curiosity. Peregrinating carries with it the idea of being on an international journey. So I'm thinking it requires us to get out where the food tastes different, or where you don't always know what you're eating, and where the sense of time might even give us vertigo, and where the language is so unfamiliar that we have to listen more. We have to study more. We have to trust other forms of communication. And here you are, community, Unitarian Universalist Church of Plano, Texas, about to go peregrinating with your new pastor, the Reverend Dr. Aija Duelm. I've been thinking about you for at least a couple weeks now. I listened when a couple weeks ago you were challenged with the idea that you're in this liminal space. You're kind of in this space where what's in the past is in the past, and you're not sure what's in the present, but in the future, but it's coming. And so I'm celebrating with you that next week this new adventure starts with your new pastor. And so your new journey is about to begin, and you've readied yourself for this. You've dreamed and you've planned. You've nourished your hopes for the future. And you've found a leader that you can trust, and that she will help navigate the road ahead. So you don't need to go to Chartres Cathedral to take up your path as a spiritual pilgrim. You are here, ready to travel light, open to all that you can experience, and trusting that as you go, you have everything you need. Mrs. Williams helped save a man from death row when she went on her all-consuming journey of the soul. So may you too, community UU, church, find yourselves peregrinating with purpose, going deep in order to truly be here. Amen.